Hi, everyone. I don't think I was expecting this big of a turnout, but it's really awesome to hear everybody wants to talk about the online safety bill. Thank you so much for joining our panel and joining SME for Labour and 89UP and these amazing panelists on a discussion on the online safety bill and the future of user-focused content online. The online safety bill has been around for years now and is a massive piece of legislation with massive impact. We haven't really talked about the repercussions or what could happen if enacted. For that reason, our discussion today is going to focus on one central question. What are the intended and unintended purposes and consequences of the online safety bill? And what should the Labour Party, but kind of also the Conservative Party and Parliament writ large, do about the online safety bill moving forward? I want to especially thank our panelists, who will introduce themselves briefly shortly. They come from a variety of backgrounds and all have something very unique to say about the future of online content and the UK's online safety bill. I couldn't be more excited to hear what they have to say, but I also want to hear what you have to say. So after our brief discussion, we'll have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session where we'd like to hear your questions and your concerns so we can all discuss together just the online safety bill. Do you want to start with your introduction?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom Mauchline. I'm here on behalf of the Legal Say Legal Type campaign. I'm standing in because Ruth Smead has got COVID and found out this morning. I am less smart and less experienced than her, but I'm going to muddle through nonetheless.
Thank you. I'm Jim Killock. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Rights Group. We work on digital privacy and free expression online, and increasingly with groups that are perhaps marginalised or disadvantaged to help them understand the impacts of digital technology on the rights framework and equalities in a more general sense.
I'm Kir Nuthi. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. We're a global nonpartisan think tank based in the US, Brussels, and in London. I focus particularly on UK and EU digital policy issues because they are so intertwined. And for the online safety bill, I've been focusing on encryption and how the vague definitions within the bill can affect a variety of communities very differently.
My name is Peymana Assad. I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Harrow. I'm also the co-founder of the Labour Foreign Policy Group. I'm actually on this panel to talk more about the personal experiences of young women in politics and how their safety is impacted online. The Evening Standard did a piece on me and some of my fellow councillors across London about the way that we've received death threats just for doing our jobs. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that experience and the responsibility of social media companies and the government to keep young women specifically safe in politics.
I think that's kind of a good place to start is why are we even talking about online safety regulation? Why do we have the online safety bill? I would love to go to you first, actually, and then we can kind of dive more niche into the online safety bill on why is the government stepping in, should they, and why is this such a big issue?
So I'm definitely not an expert on online safety or bills because I think they're very complex and there are lots of problems with this online safety bill that lots of groups have had, especially when it comes down to freedom of speech, anonymity online, and the safety of what you post and whether that is seen as illegal content by certain governments and states. So for me as a young female woman councillor in London, the biggest thing for me is being able to do my job without receiving anonymous death threats online from accounts that I don't know where they're posting from, I don't know who they are, and I don't know why that they're sending me this stuff based on really, really specific, small, local issues, that you think that people shouldn't be so aggravated about, but they are. My experience was I went to an event that was organised by my constituents in a university, Westminster University. We have a campus in Harrow. And I went and represented my constituents at this event. And after I came out, I received consistent phone calls to my private phone number every half an hour. And the individual said to me, I know where you live. I found your number online from the council's website. Because we have a legal obligation to post this information about councillors on the pages on our council web pages. And I went to the police and I went to my local council leader, but the police didn't take any action. because they said that no threat had been done to me in person, so they couldn't take any action on it. They waited until it got to a point where I was receiving this for 2 weeks, and then I was given an actual police escort for my public events for the council to try and keep me safe. But that experience made me think how important it is for young women to be able to be free in expressing their opinions and to not receive hate online. I think it's really, really important that we do that. And I'd be really interested to hear, the specifics on the online safety bill. But I think the thing that I'm most interested in is the anonymity aspect of this, because the online bill does talk about limiting anonymity online. And as a female young councillor, I would like to see that controlled. But then again, on the other hand, I see how it impacts, women in Iran, for example, women in Afghanistan who are fighting against very authoritarian dictatorship regimes, and democracy is under threat all across the world, and free speech is really important. And so that's one of the aspects that I'm really interested in hearing from the experts on. But I think that we really need to keep the safety aspect in mind, because it disproportionately impacts Black and ethnic minority young women online in a way that it doesn't impact other people. So thank you.
I think you mentioned that you've spoken a lot with marginalized communities and just communities in general on the effects of free speech regulation. Could you speak a little bit more to why now?
Yeah, so we've been we have a program working on firstly with migrant organisations and also with racial justice organisations, and there is a free speech aspect to this as well. It's not all about the content from unpleasant and racist individuals. It's also about the potential for material to be removed that really shouldn't be. The classic example is things like pictures of violence and which are classed as gore by Facebook. So if you have a picture of a policeman violently beating up somebody who happens to be Black, and that gets posted, that's a violation of Facebook's terms and conditions because it's gore. And Facebook have a kind of an amelioration policy for this. So they say, well, if we get advance warning that there might be a riot in a country, or there might be a political demonstration, and therefore there might be some violence, we'll suspend temporarily our policy against posting pictures that involve blood and gore, just in case the police do something unpleasant. But of course, that's not the real world. You don't know when there are going to be human rights violations that policy can be suspended. So it makes it very, very difficult for people reporting human rights abuses to get that material posted. Same goes for YouTube. There is a lot of policies there again against gore and violence. And it's understandable why those policies are in place, but the effect on free expression is very high, and where it matters, right, where the police and the state are in that kind of level of violence. So I'm sure we would hear a lot from Ruth today also about those sort of things, the impacts of those circulating that kind of material in Ukraine, for instance. So this is a kind of international standards issue as well. It's like if the UK starts policing material, then how does that work elsewhere? So for every kind of material that you want policed, or this bill says is dangerous, you have to consider whether that's also likely to be things that people rely on to explain when there are problems and difficulties and get information out where it really matters. I think there are also questions like language, for instance. There's a lot of content that's been removed as terrorism because it uses Islamic phrases, for instance, or just doesn't use English in effect. And because minority languages in the UK are not well understood by these global corporations, policing content in those areas is very, very difficult. There are even questions around free elections. You think about Lebanon, some of the groups that stand in elections in Lebanon are prescribed and counted as terrorists. Therefore, even electoral commentary in those circumstances ends up being against both UK law and these platforms' policies. So it isn't a very simple question, this. It's a very, very complicated one. And for that reason, in Europe, they've tried to kind of say, well, let's look at the question of, is it legal or is it illegal? That's where we draw the line. Let's make sure there are very strong processes to protect people who are posting material that is legal, legitimate, and important. And where it comes to other sorts of questions, we deal with those in other sorts of ways. I maybe talk too long now and should let other people talk. There are big questions about where corporate power lies, and probably my biggest problem with this as a bill is we've got these huge corporations with vast powers who are exercising it in an irresponsible manner, and our solution is to give more power to those corporations to do more of the same. And do we really think that is going to result in an improvement? I think it'll only make differences at the margins. And if we really want to address the problem of corporate online power, then we have to do it by addressing the question of monopoly and about putting power in the hands of consumers, not to have tick buttons that the government have mandated to have material sorted or not sorted or whatever it happens to be, but us having choices about who we get the information from, how that's presented to us, and if we don't like Facebook, we can leave without it meaning that our own personal networks break down. That's where we need to be. That's where policy should be leading. I'll come on to more of that later, but it's just like the wrong approach, to my mind, for a very, very serious problem.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Just come in. So I think your story is really personal, because we did some polling about what does the general public actually want to see when it comes to online regulation. And your story was basically a real example of what the public said they want to solve. The problem is that this bill, sort of every Secretary of State, and there have been 6 now that have shifted this bill through, have sort of talked about those types of stories and trying to solve them. But if you look at the wording of this bill, actually they do very little to help that. So sort of Ruth had 2 death threats sent to her. One was sent to her office when she was an MP, and one was sent online. The one that got sent to the office was solved and sorted 3 years ago. The one that was sent online has got to be delayed just again and is still not gone through the court system. And I think that the real big missing part of this bill is additional support for the National Crime Agency, additional support for the police, because actually lots of these problems can be solved. So, for example, if you remember in the World Cup when all the racist abuse was sent on Twitter to footballers, 99% of that was sent by accounts that could have been, even if they were anonymous on the face, that could have been worked out who they were. The stuff they were sending broke a law, and we had the powers to prosecute them. It just wasn't because of cuts in our policing. And it feels like actually this bill could, it's trying to do too many things. So that's the first thing. And then I think just sort of a couple of other things that I think is worth us thinking about. One is this sort of new concept called legal but harmful that the bill brings forward. This is this idea that content that is legal by the laws of our land can be removed or sort of censored because it is harmful. And now the word phrase harmful, sort of politicians, when you speak to them, sort of go, well, it's the nasty things on the internet. We all know what it is. The problem is it has no definition. And it's coupled with massive fines. And what we've seen at that time and time again, that you don't have those definitions in place. That what you find is minority voices are targeted most often, and if I was going to be fined that much, I would err on the side of caution and take everything down too. So I'm I sort of understand where the tech companies come from, but we've seen it time and time again. We saw it with Tumblr, with LGBT content. There is a Washington University study that looked at Black vernacular American English that gets censored more often than white vernacular American English on social networks. Mumsnet sees it all the time when their members describe women's bodies and women's health issues. They get censored because algorithms deem them to be harmful. And we've seen them, and Lebanon, I think, is a good example, that because the languages used are not the ones that sort of Facebook sort of uses day to day in their offices. Sort of anti-Hezbollah statements were flagged as pro-Hezbollah statements and removed, and sort of just a massive content issue. And I think sort of on the crime side of things, that is, one, it's bad because it's censorous, but two, it is bad because that is evidence. So we're sort of, the unintended consequence of this is it becomes more hard, not easier, to prosecute racists and abusers, because actually we're sending things, sort of censoring them before they can be seen by police. And so it's one of the reasons why we're asking for a digital evidence locker. So that would be a sort of, if this does come through, we're hoping they remove legal harmful, and there's been some good movement on that. But if you do have that, then there should be at least be a digital evidence locker so the police can look in and prosecute things. But also the researchers can look and go, actually, are we over censoring? Are we under censoring? What is happening there? And then just the two final points, sort of before we just sort of ad-libbing at the moment. One, I think that sort of this bill does a lot of things, and there's a bit which is like we see this in business regulation. When we see something that we want to change, Parliament goes and makes it illegal, right? That's fine. They can do that. There's lots of stuff in this bill that people talk about. So suicide content, sort of different forms of abuse. That, like, a really small bill could move through Parliament quite quickly and make those things illegal if parliamentarians want to. But what they're trying to do here, though, is sort of abdicate their job and outsource it to tech companies, and that sort of is I understand why they want to do it, because it's hard having these conversations. You don't want to be the person that is sort of edits content as an MP, but it does make Nick Clegg the most powerful man on the internet, which is weird for sort of the Tory party and the Labour Party sort of trying to push that forward, and sort of seems like the wrong approach. And that's not just because personally I don't particularly like Nick Clegg.
I see we've got a new panelist, so could you briefly introduce yourself and just give your point?
Apologies, I actually thought, I'm surprised a Fringe meeting at the Sunday morning of Labour Party Fringe, starting on time. It's very bizarre. My name's Parmjit Dhanda. I was a minister in the last Labour government, served under Blair and Brown, including as an education minister. And I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of doing this kind of stuff through legislation. Now, my history in this and around technology and protecting children comes back to a request I received from the mother of Millie Dowler. You remember Millie Dowler, that horrific murder? We were all shocked as a nation at the time when it happened. And it goes to show how technology moves on so quickly, because she wanted to involve me, and I was more than happy to get involved, with something called the Teach Your Mum to Text campaign. Sounds funny, but it meant so much to her, because she feels that if she could only have communicated with Millie by text message without kids switching off their phone when their parents ring them, because you're so embarrassing, it might have made a difference. Where are you? You well? Little messages like that. Now, about that time that I came into the department, you need to understand the politics of these things and these bills and how challenging they can be. We have now a civil service that has been cut to the bone, so we're relying on them to give us good briefings and good legislation, because they actually write the bulk of the bill. It shouldn't be down to the minister to do it, although I must say, when I came into the department, local elections on the Thursday, reshuffle that night. I get a phone call from Tony Blair on the Friday morning. I'm in the department on the Monday. On the Tuesday, I've got second reading of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Bill, and the following week, I've got third reading of a child safety bill. It's extraordinary, the turnaround and the pressures of these things. And what this particular bill is trying to do, illegal content, okay, you can kind of legislate for that because illegal content is illegal content. Content harmful to children, well, if you can define that, and you mostly can, not entirely, but mostly can, so you can make a difference there. And as has already been mentioned by panel members here, legal content that is harmful to adults, well, how do you go about legislating that? Because I remember when I was saying this, do you remember the List 99 scandal? You probably don't. It involved, the country was shocked at the time because some teachers in schools were found not to have had proper CRB checks taken and had sex offenders in schools. So mad panic, media, Daily Mail all over it, government legislates straight away, and we have a vetting and barring scheme that I've got to take through Parliament just like that overnight. And I'm being asked at the dispatch box to define what's regulated activity of an adult with a child, or with an adult and a vulnerable adult. What do you mean by that? And before you know it, you have a scheme that envelops 7.5, 8 million people being registered, because legislative process is a big axe. So getting it right and defined is always going to be a big challenge, and in the end, we've ended up with a whole new regulator coming in off the back of that. So getting these things right is a big challenge. And it's interesting what you'll have seen, what Cllr Peymana said about this particular bill, that she wasn't going to legislate for hurt feelings. Well, do we legislate? Should we legislate for hurt feelings? I think there's several things that we need to do. Firstly, when Labour comes to power, if it's going to follow through and do these things properly, it needs to make sure that the civil service is equipped to deal with it. That's really important, because otherwise we will get bad laws and we will not be able to do any of this stuff. The idea of legal content that's harmful to others, look, there's probably representatives of Facebook and Google and others in the room, because there usually is at these kinds of meetings, taking their notes, scribbling them back, sending them back up the food chain and all the rest of it. Well, look, there's no way, if there's any flex in legislation, that you're going to be able to hold them to account. They're not going to spend £18 million paying a fine if they can get around it because they can get through the legislation. So these things have to be watertight. So I think, in some respects, maybe Cami will disagree with her on almost everything, but she may have had a point in terms of how do you legislate for these matters. And finally, because I really want to hear from you all as well, I'm sure the rest of the panel do as well, but in terms of legislating for bad feelings or bad behaviour, I think that was a really good point. We were all hurt and upset, not least because we're not very good at penalties when it comes to football tournaments, but behaviour towards black players at the European Championships final. We thought, well, actually, hang on. If there was a simple process of registration, surely the mood, this doesn't require big legislation, but a registration system for something like Twitter would, I think, take a lot of the poison and the hurt and the harm out of it. Now, that may be controversial and too regulatory for many people, maybe people in the room, but I think it is a common sense approach that doesn't require the huge hammer of complex legislation and would make a real difference in terms of people's online safety and security. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think what we've heard here is 4 panelists who all think that nuance is key in regulating online content, and each of them with different definitions on what the nuances are. I also realize that with all of us talking about the online safety bill, we've probably not fully explained the online safety bill. The online safety bill is like hundreds and hundreds of pages of legislative text. Each of them are focusing on different binding/semi-binding legal obligations for what we can and can't say online in the UK, or what United Kingdom users can or can't say if it's of material risk of significant harm, which is a paraphrased version of the actual part of the text. I kind of want to dive into that because each of you have had different discussions of the struggle moderation faces, be it big companies or like random people on the internet. Can you speak, each of you individually, to just why a broad horizontal framework, kind of like the online safety bill, could lead to bad conclusions for the communities we all care about?
I'm so sorry, I have to go to speak at something. And I just want to say one sentence if the whole room doesn't mind me properly interrupting. I've come because of 4.5 million people suffering from mental illness who are pursued by the pernicious gambling industries online all the time. I've only got a leaflet about the suicide effects. Thank you. And anything any of you could do. I don't want much regulation usually, but their relentless pursuit of people suffering from a mental illness. They make 86% of their profit from 5% of people. And we are all consenting and allowing this. And it's escalating, especially in young people. So I'm so sorry we have to go.
Can I come back straight on that point?
Yeah, go for it.
So this is exactly the kind of problem we have with this bill. This bill will say perhaps gambling content of certain sort is harmful and maybe try to suppress it. But actually what is really driving this is the use of personal data to profile individuals because they keep coming back for gambling. Oh, look, that person keeps coming back. And if we get them a free, give them £5 free, they'll spend...
lost £10,000
Yeah.
in 24
That's right.
hours.
Yeah.
And they haven't done the affordability check.
Well, so they look like a good customer, right? That's basically the bottom line. To these companies, these people look like good customers that they ought to target. Now, there's a thing called the Data Reform Bill going through Parliament at the moment, which will make it easier for these companies to do this kind of thing, to pay less attention to the use of data, to make it harder for people to understand how their data is being used, and make it harder for the ICO to intervene, because that will generate profits. And that is that is the vision that the current government have for your life online across everything. Companies should make money out of data. They should be allowed to profile you. They should be allowed to improve customer services without considering the impacts upon you, which is exactly things like gambling addicts. And the result will be disaster across the board, but not least for online harms, because all of the online economy, a lot of the online economy is currently about generating profit through attention. It's about making you interested or angry or reviled by content which you then share, react to, spend time with, right? Where even when it's things you really dislike and you're typing away saying, you're an idiot, right? That's what they want. And but why they want it is because it's easier then to get adverts in front of you, and that generates some revenue. You take things like the data protection regime, which makes a lot of this unlawful if it's properly enforced, right? That's your mechanism for reducing that harm and putting power back into consumers by saying, well, you have to consent. You have to agree to being exploited in that way. And when it comes to things like mental illness, it's simply illegal. The ICO should have sorted that problem out donkeys years ago. There are people prosecuting those companies to stop that kind of gambling profiling.
£15 million fine about 3 weeks ago. But that's a drop in a £15 billion profit.
So it needs the ICO to sort it out. The ICO is being actively undermined by this government, and the legislation that's going through will make it nearly impossible for the ICO to react. So we hear these examples. We were hearing this morning about employment, and now we're talking about a series of online harms. All of this is about data exploitation, and this government is trying to pull the rug from under our feet and make sure that it's easier for companies to do appalling things. Why? Because it will benefit a small number of high-tech companies in the UK, the likes of Palantir, any other number, Sauron's Eye, whatever it happens to be, right? All these companies are basically, they're the companies, the health industry as well, the sort of companies who want to exploit health data. These are the companies that Conservatives want to benefit. But you have two weapons against that kind of environment. One of them is competition policy, which is about breaking it up and putting power back in the hands of consumers and citizens to get the results and the services they want. And the other is data protection, which is about protecting the way that your data is used and you having a say and understanding of how it is. And neither of those are anything to do with the Online Safety Bill. The Online Safety Bill is all about dealing with the problems once they've already happened and saying, oh gosh, these terrible companies are doing terrible things with people's data, and we'll just try and sort out the worst little bits at the top. That's what we're talking about. We've got all this attention on a bill which can, at its absolute best, deal with a fraction of the problems, while the two things that really need doing, sorting out these companies as monopolies and sorting out the exploitation of data, the government is either doing nothing about or actively trying to make it worse.
White paper on this sitting in Downing Street for 18 months, delayed 6 times because they don't want to do the recommendations. Can I give you many thanks, especially this young man who's offered me his seat twice. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry to.
Jumping back to online moderation a little bit, but kind of jumping off of just the fact that it's legislating lists of content, not necessarily content moderation. How do definitions in the Online Safety Bill compel or de facto compel platforms to restrict access to content we want online? Individually, I'm just thinking encryption in the sense of private communications are included. And I would much rather tell my friends and close family my location, my phone number, my secrets, things that are to do with my public safety on an encrypted platform versus out there on a messaging service that somebody could hack. Much easier. The fact that it does regulate private content worries me, but it's more than just that. You sound like you had something.
Yeah, so look, I think the big worry that we have with this is just a lack of definition on everything, and how that makes, when coupled with these massive fines, is just going to be, it sort of force companies to be overly censorious to ensure that they are mitigating the risk in their UK markets, right? And that is the conversations we have had sort of with people that work in this space around content moderation. And the problem you have as well with this is that because there is so much content being posted, that you have to use algorithms to do this, and algorithms, for a system of rules, and without definitions, those rules become really are really woolly, and that again just means that you end up with over-censorship. And I sort of mentioned the ones earlier that we see this already. We see this already with content on different platforms, and this would just put a turbocharger on it. And then I suppose the second thing with content moderation as well is that if you then swap out algorithms, which happens in some places, it is a human being, but it is a human being that we are forcing to look at some of the most grotesque stuff on the internet. And so we need to ensure, as the Labour Party, I think that we're ensuring safeguardings around those jobs to make sure that they are humane and not ruining people's mental health. But secondly is that it is a human being that gets to look at it for a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and normally not in Britain as well. And I think there is a question, which is, if it is a person, Germany, I think, has said that it has to be in Germany because different countries have different values. And actually, if you're looking at something for a second, 2 seconds, whether you think something is appropriate to the content policy is going to be less about what is in the online safety bill and is more about the instincts of that person. And actually, if they have a conservative instinct, they have a homophobic instinct, they have a misogynistic instinct, then that is going to come out in the way that moderation.
Well, considering we're at a party conference, it's also the Secretary of State and Ofcom and the level of discretion, isn't it? The fact that it's not necessarily, while the Conservative Party may pass this bill or may not, I'm not going to claim to understand what's going to go on with it. If it's a Conservative Secretary of State for DCMS, it's going to be completely different implementation than if it was a Labour Secretary for DCMS. And how are all of our diverse communities supposed to handle this? And how are the globe's diverse communities supposed to handle these regulations if it is just so broad?
Yeah, we commissioned a QC then, KC now, and they are learning. To look into the online safety bill, and that was one of the things that his legal analysis really showed up. That his words were, and it was Nadine Dorries at the time, so there was a particular worry about this, is that a homophobic Secretary of State could ban gay content within 24 hours with no need for primary legislation. That is really worrying, and I think there is a sort of, and we've sort of slightly seen it in sort of around other topics, but sort of one campaign from the Daily Mail to weaponise this law could see vast amounts of content taken away. And if there are any Conservatives in the room, just think about it the other way around. One campaign from The Guardian, when Labour finally wins an election, we'll see Conservative content removed. And sort of there is, I think, a naivety from MPs when you talk to them, where they're like, this bill is going to get rid of the bad stuff off the internet, but how do you define the bad stuff? Because if you talk to Toby Young, his definition of bad stuff is not going to be the same as mine, and sort of how that works.
I think one of the things that we need to remember is why this online safety bill even came into the fray in the public sphere. And one of the reasons, or the driving factors for the Conservative government, was there are other governments out there who are controlling online content. There are authoritarian dictatorship regimes out there who are controlling and reporting online content and controlling the type of things that people post. So I think that we shouldn't forget that it would be very different for a Conservative versus a Labour the Secretary of State in that position. And I think the other thing that we need to remember is social media is an incredibly powerful tool. It impacts community tensions within across the UK, as what we've seen happen in Leicester, for example, recently. It impacts our elections, it impacts a lot of things, and we need to understand how powerful that is in the real world, and giving more power to corporations to try and police that. I don't know how beneficial that is to our society. And I guess the question I would ask is where is the line? You know, how much are governments allowed to do this? As from my own personal experience, I want people to be safe online. I want this stuff to be controlled, but then I also want people to have their free speech and to be able to post freely. A thing that I always think is that people behave completely differently online to how they would behave in person, and because they think they can get away with it. And I think that is what we need to factor in. And I do want to say something on police power, because it was mentioned previously. When I reported my death threats to the police, some of it was online, some of it was offline, they said, we don't have enough powers to deal with this, to actually go after people, and you should, as a campaigner, campaign for more police power. But I think that comes with a caveat of making sure that the police have their own reforms in place so that they deal with this stuff effectively and not in a biased, institutionally biased way. So I think that we should always keep that in mind. But I always question where is the line, because I see the German government reporting content online that they don't personally agree with, that isn't in line with their ideology. The Turkish government is doing the same. There are governments out there that are controlling the narrative based on their ideological thoughts. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind.
Yes.
I think it's a really interesting debate about scope as well, about scope of legislation in terms of how you define. And that's a real problem for us, especially as our society is getting longer, great likelihood of dementia, vulnerability, mental health. But it's not just those groups that are being teased into behaviours online, giving up their bank details and all the rest of it. I mean, I was aware the other day of someone who missed out on university and being told, if you go here, give your bank details, you can get a place abroad to do such and such. So how you tie all that up in the scope of a bill, I think, and it's a global problem because there are no barriers or borders in terms of where this is operating. But we do need to find a way of getting a grip on this, because it's going to become a bigger rather than a smaller problem. Part of the thing that we can do is at an educative level, and perhaps we need something in the curriculum for people to be more aware of the online dangers and how this is growing. But as I've just said, and as the lady who came in early on and made her contribution, this isn't just about kids as well. It's about older and vulnerable people as well, who we as governments, all governments have said, get online. Older people, use Facebook, use this, get your services, don't go to the post office anymore, get paid that way. So we're shifting people on there, so we've created a more vulnerable audience. So now we have a duty to find a way to protect them. How we do that, like I said, I think in terms of tackling hate, I think it's eminently doable. It's much more doable than the other stuff around behaviours, where you do need much cooperation from Facebook and from Google and other operators. But they really are, they're lawyered up to the hilt, they're public affairs up to the hilt. So it's going to need something, a real kind of change in mindset to make that happen. And it's not something that we can just do within the borders of one country as well. And I just think, but taking the tone down to what I said earlier on in terms of a better level of registration. I hear about the incident that you had about hate crime or something that went to the police. I ended up with a pig's head on my front lawn, a few feet away from where the kids were having their breakfast one morning, which was left. And I'm convinced to this day that wouldn't have happened if it isn't the kind of whipping up that you get of people, and people see stuff online about people's differences or cultures or why we feel it's easy to abuse people in whether it's public office or other areas of life, footballers or whoever. So there's a whole array of things that need to be done here. But I would say, and I may be arguing against myself here, that legal content that's harmful to communities, it does sound like that is an area that needs to be explored, not least for the contribution that we heard about gambling earlier on, not least for the way that older vulnerable people are losing their savings by pressing the wrong buttons or being lured into retirement or saving plans. We can't ignore it, but to tackle it and make this legislation tighter, we will also need far, far better equipped government and civil service to help, hopefully, the next Labour government.
I think it's fair to say we all agree on needing to tackle it from an enforcement side of view. I think what we're seeing is a debate on how we promote free expression if we're going to tackle online harm through increased enforcement. I mean, personally for me, free speech is incredibly important, and tackling things under a legal definition would mean that when I was a kid, I wouldn't have figured out how to relate to my culture, my identity, after I went through so many years just hating like what I grew up as. And if I wasn't able to go on forums as a kid, that I'll admit probably shouldn't have been on, I wouldn't have fostered a strong conviction and a strong sense of identity to this day. And I think that's the balance of it, which I'm going to pivot us rather hard now, because the online safety bill is on the table. And because it is on the table, we can try to scrap it, as is, I think, many in this room would want to scrap it. But is there a way to fix it? Is there a way to fix the free speech issues we've been talking about and the privacy issues we've been talking about to hold perpetrators accountable online while also empowering women and LGBT youth and immigrants and first gens of diverse communities? How do we square that circle? I'll start with you, and then I'll just move down.
I think it's really tough. It's really tough to find a solution to that, because if I was trying to find the solution, it would be get rid of anonymity online. That's incredibly controversial, because activists use that to try and challenge authoritarian regimes all over the world. And if one country starts to do that, then another country follows. And then the other issue is asking people to register themselves with these social media platforms. But then that's a whole data issue, giving social media giants all this data that they can actually use and then promote to third-party organizations that can target you with some of the things that we were talking about. So I think it's really, really difficult. I think that what the key thing is putting power back into the hands of the people, and allowing users to take control of their experience online. So when I report an abuse online, that needs to be taken seriously by the social media corporation and not be dismissed just because it doesn't fit into a certain section or bracket of whatever they've defined as hate speech online. But actually have people behind the computer to actually look at this and think about it in a completely different way. That's how I would approach it. But that requires huge manpower, which I don't think social media giants are ready to do. So I think it's a really tough one, and it's I'd love to know what the solution is, but I think it's really difficult.
Jim, do you have your ideal wish list for the online safety bill?
Well, I think it is unsalvageable, to be honest, the online safety bill. I mean, I have to say that. I think that the simple thing to do is just compare how the Europeans have approached the same problem. They have a very similar kind of legislative agenda, but they've got a very different way of doing it. So they, with the European system that's being introduced, the digital services will have to provide mechanisms for material to be reported and removed. They have to have people allowed to help with that reporting, but there are also mechanisms for making sure that material is properly evaluated, and if mistakes are made, that those are rectified. And that goes right up into being able to appeal into the court system and dealing with it in a proper legal manner. The UK system, on the other hand, just says, well, it's terms and conditions. If you've got a problem with that, you can take them to court. for breach of terms and conditions. No one's going to sue Facebook for a breach of terms and conditions because a Facebook post has been removed. That is just a non-starter. So the government has basically just kind of placed a legal fiction that your rights are protected, where actually it's all about computers removing material. That's what it's really about. It's about scouring everything, including your private messaging, for material the government doesn't want. And I just think that, obviously that is prior restraint, right? We're going back to the 1700s where you had to have a license to print. Now, if something's on a banned list, or a computer says it looks like something that ought to be on a banned list, which is really what's happening, then your stuff gets stopped before it gets anywhere. And this is now a legal duty, right? That's just completely the wrong way around. It's also, by the way, going to come into complete conflict with Europe, because Europe says you can't do that. It says, general monitoring of people's content is not allowed. So companies are going to have to, for the same content, both scour it for a million things for the UK's legal environment, and for the EU's environment, make sure they don't scour it at all under any circumstances. So you square that, right? And the only real way to do that is by severing the UK and saying we have the UK internet, UK net, and then the rest of it, right? And that's the only way you can do it. If you want an ideal way of dealing with these problems, it already exists. This is a paradox, right? There are two platforms I would kind of point you to. One is a social network, which is a network of networks, rather like email, right? A network of networks. It's called Mastodon.social. Is one of the sites. All these sites use simply a messaging protocol to swap messages. Rather like you can use, say, a Vodafone phone, and you don't have to worry about phoning up someone on O2. You use any of these sites and they will talk to each other. And that means that the abusive people can't actually operate, because whenever they try to send messages to other sites, which are basically unpleasant, their site gets banned. And so you have a sort of self-moderating system, rather like, again, with email, spam sites just get blocked. Same sort of thing happens with there's an encrypted messaging thing called Matrix, or a Matrix.org does a similar thing with instant messaging. Lots of people have different servers and different operators. They all talk to each other just like email, and if you don't like particular groups of people, you just block them, ban them, or if it's illegal, you prosecute and take the server down. That's the way this can work. It requires decentralization, it requires competition, it requires opening up Facebook and Twitter so that they're made to work with other companies, and then people can find the kind of environment they want. I understand that is all going to be a bit like, what the hell are you talking about? I understand that, but it's going to be a little bit difficult to take in as I say it. But I can tell you now that if you want a safe environment online, then you sign up to Mastodon, because it's all completely well policed. Volunteers and individuals make sure that abusive people are kept off, and it's not run by corporations, and that's why it is run in the interests of users, because users own and control it in effect. Now that shouldn't be a surprise to members of the Labour Party, that if you put people in control of their technology, then they run it in a way that is responsible. And when it's in the hands of corporations, that doesn't necessarily happen. And that's why I point to competition policy and opening these platforms up as the way to break this logjam. It is not by trying to police the content, it is by trying to put the power in the hands of users to decide what kind of online environment they actually want, and then voting with their feet.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to rush the last two.
Should we just do questions?
Do you want to both just give like 2 quick sentences on how you fix it?
I think that's a lovely idea about a kind of almost people's cooperative of this taking over and doing it.
Doesn't need to be as extreme as that.
The issue with that is always who those people are. Which can create a whole other set of problems. And voting with their feet, whether that would happen. The alternative is better legislation and getting it right. So if we can get it right, I think that's an idea.
Go back to the drawing board, maybe.
Well, maybe not going back to the drawing board, but being incremental, bringing something in that does some good things, and then building on that rather than trying to do everything in one fell swoop and holding it up.
Yeah, and I think just really quickly, I think for us, the bill is really bad. So, like really, really bad. And if you speak to like people in DCMS, they sometimes don't even know what's in it, which is like worrying in and of itself. So like, I do think that the bill probably isn't salvageable. If you were going to though, because it looks like the Tory party going to push this through, we would suggest reframing it completely around illegal content, taking out legal but harmful, making it a sort of a bill that strengthens protections around illegal content. There are some issues with that as well, but yeah, that's how we do it.
And then mine's a completely unrelated amendment. I want to remove encrypted protections in private communications from the bill so we can speak freely to each other and not have people look at it.